Welcome everyone. My name is Alexander Reich. I represent the Polish Alternative Fuels Association, PSPA. Today we will explore how the regulatory framework prepared by the EU institutions for the decarbonization of road transport in Europe responds to the consumer habits, the consumer choices, and the consumer readiness to deploy e-mobility in a robust way in Europe. We will have a particular focus on the CE region, with a very concentrated discussion on Poland as a highly representative market of the CE, Central Eastern European region. And we will explore how this market shows the problem of a two-speed development of e-mobility in the EU between the Western Northern nations and the CE nations and member states of the EU. We will start with a presentation that will show the results of the Element Energy Consumer Choice Study for the entire European market. The presentation will be viewed by Céline Cluzel, the London office partner of Element Energy. It will then be followed by a presentation that will show the Polish focus for that report. And then we have a panel discussion with esteemed guests that will discuss with me how Fit for 55, mainly AFIR, responds to that consumer positivity that we will see in these reports, both the European one and the Polish one. Let's get to it. Céline, I pass the floor to you.
Right, I'll go straight into what we've done. So we've surveyed 2,000 new car buyers in 7 countries mapped here. Do revise your flags because we use flags in graphs later. Together they make 80% of car sales. So what's special about the survey is not just the size, it's the fact that it contains a choice experiment. So what that means is that we don't just ask people, will you buy an EV? And take the answer for granted. Instead, we make them take several choice questions. So there's an example here. It's more because it's not about the details, about the concept. They have to choose between 2 types of electric cars and a petrol or diesel car. And we vary the description, what matters, driving range, price, etc. And every time they choose something, they tell us how they trade off attributes, because we never make them choose something that is the cheapest and most performing technology. Because we do that a high number of times across a sample, we can then build a statistical model on how people purchase things. And one of the key advantages is that you can then look at what would be the sales if price decreased that much or if driving range increased that much, etc. One of the other interesting things when you've got that purchase behavior model is that you can look at the inherent preferences for bias that people might have for technologies. And I'll talk about that with that graph, which is slightly complex. So let me take you through it. Here, what we do is that we look, considering what we learned from the choice experiment, what would people choose if they had to choose between a battery electric vehicle, BEV, a plug-in hybrid vehicle, PHEV from now on, or a petrol diesel car, if else was equal. So it's just the name that changed. And I know it's a bit weird to think they're equal because they're not, but to make them equal as much as possible, we look at the case where the same price, the same running cost, people have access to public and charging infrastructure, private and public, and the driving ranges are fairly high. So if people didn't care about the tag EV, non-EV, we will see here that the 3 colors will be equally distributed. That's not the case. What you can see if you look at the oil markets is that people overwhelmingly prefer battery electric vehicles and no one wants a petrol or diesel car, or else is equal. So what does that mean? It means that people today buy petrol and diesel cars, not because they prefer them, it's because they're cheaper. And it's an important distinction. Like, as Katrina said, we've done some work before, and if you look at the case of the UK, the second flag here, back in 2011, the share of people who will have said my preferred choice is EV or PHEV or else being equal was only 2%. I mean, at that stage, there were some consumer segments to which we could have given an EV for free, they would have did not wanted it. In 2015, that share became 22%. Now it's 100%. So yes, consumers are ready for EVs, but EVs are not quite ready because we're not yet at purchase price parity. So let's look at the real world now. So here, let me explain the title of the graph first. We're looking at the share of demand in the case where people can choose between 5 different technologies for petrol car, diesel cars, hybrid, PHEV, PEV. So they can choose between all of this. And if there is if indeed all these technologies are in the showroom all the time and there's no supply constraint, then the share of demand becomes the share of sales. But because we haven't looked at supply, this is called the share of demand. What you see on the graph called baseline is that the blue line, which is the BEV, becomes the highest one in 2025. I repeat, by 2025, BEV will be the most demanded type of car. That is tomorrow. After that, things just continue improving and all the other powertrains are fairly low. I have to say there's several things that make that baseline conservative. First one is that we're not accounting for the fact that some powertrains will be removed from the showroom. So we're not including the fact that several countries are looking at phase out of petrol and diesel cars. Secondly, there are a lot of city-level policies such as low-emission zones. They come under several names, but the principle is the same. They will influence things that's not accounted for explicitly here. For instance, in France, the zone à faible émission will forbid brand new diesel cars even to enter cities. The third reason why these things might be quite conservative is that we take the attitudes of people as measured in 2021. As I explained before, we've seen that attitudes change as the technology becomes more mainstream. So actually the attitudes could shift even further from PHEV to BEV, for instance. But the fourth parameter that makes this projection, at least in the eyes of some people, too conservative, is because we use our own price projections for the different type of cars. And there's some publication from serious organizations that predict that battery electric vehicles will become cheaper than what we predict and will actually reach price parity earlier than what we predict. So the upfront price parity before 2028 for all type of cars. So we've run the model with that cheaper BEV case, and that's the graph on the left, and we see things go even higher and faster. That is the core of the findings, that purchase price is a factor number one in the consumer choice. Improving driving range and charging speeds are really secondary factors. And now I'm going to make a statement that might upset some people, which is that charging infrastructure does support the gross PV market, but it doesn't generate demand on itself. So yes, charging points are needed, especially for people who don't have anything else to charge, etc. And charging points that we see are already useful, as in they will be used. They will see some queues, or queues will get worse so if we don't install more as the market grows. But these statements are different from saying the sales could be higher if we had much more charge points now. Nice, two different statements. Price is the number one barrier. However, the situation with charging infrastructure is closely linked to parking. So let's have a look at the parking situation. These statistics are quite exciting because this has never been measured before, because this looks at where car-owning households park their car, which is different than the general households. So if we look at the one called all markets, you can see that most people fall into the blue categories. So 59% of people, that's the people who have access to the preferred form of charging, which is home charging, because they have a garage or driveway, or at least very little barriers to have charging there. So the first good news. There is an outlier though that we need to flag. Spain is much lower there. The concept of driveway seems to be a rare luxury in Spain. So here, public charging infrastructure will have a much short-term impact on the EV sales, for instance. But even if we look at people who don't have a private or street, so the other 41%, some of them are in places where charging infrastructure is not that hard to install. But even though people who are reliant on public charging infrastructure, if you do provide public charging, they're only 12% less likely to buy a battery electric vehicles than people who have a garage. 12% is lower than what I think people will have guessed, but I think it's good news, and it reflects the fact that, again, cost is much more important in the purchase decision. I'm going to change topic now, but cost is still going to be the core of it, namely talking about the so-called e-fuels. So the concept of e-fuels shortly, it's a synthetic fuel. You go from pure CO2 renewable electricity you go through a recipe, a few steps, and you can reproduce the molecule that is petrol-like or diesel-like. Because there are several steps to make these molecules, it's expensive. It's more expensive than petrol and diesel refined from oil. So just by saying that, I've told you many times that price matters. Just by saying e-fuels are going to be an expensive fuel, it should be obvious they're not going to be attractive to consumers. However, there's still some people lobbying for the case of e-fuels for cars. So it's worth reiterating again by looking at what the choice models tell us. So this graph looks at consumer demand for all the vehicles that contain an engine, so petrol, diesel cars, hybrid, and PHEV. The gray line is the line I was shown before, although it's hidden at the start. So to start with, this type of cars are the dominant in the market, but they go down. Now we looked at a case in red where we make some e-fuels and we say this is what people will choose to buy when they buy a petrol or diesel car. And that fuel is made from European wind. Because it's more expensive, actually accelerates the demise of the cars fitted with an engine. Now, if we want to be pushing the story even further, and we look at the case where we will make ourselves depend on e-fuels that is relying on Middle East solar electricity. So I repeat, relying on Middle East energy. That might remind you something. In that case, there might be a scope for the e-fuel to become cheaper than petrol in the 2040s. And that's why you see the orange line departs from the grey line, but it doesn't change the story. People want demand suddenly again to drive a car fitted with an engine because people have embraced the transition to electromobility. That's the message I leave you with. Yes, EVs are inevitable. Many people have contributed to that study, and I thank them. A little thank you to Open Accent, who were allowed to study the survey for us in all these countries. My colleagues Element, many of them helped, but a special shout out to my colleague Charles Erdley, who not only is delightful to work with, but he did a sterling job in this study.
Thank you, Celine. So we now have a clearer picture of how the report shows the consumer choices, the consumer approach to electric mobility and the entirety of Europe. Now, let's take a Polish focus. And therein, the presentation prepared by PSPA based on a report prepared by PSPA, which was an enhanced version of the Element Energy study, but enhanced in a way that was focused on the Polish market. So the Polish market and its focus study was prepared on the basis of the Element Energy study, and it was developed into a way that presented an additional chapter that focused on the Polish reality, the CE reality of consumer choices and consumer approach to e-mobility. But a little bit of an introduction and adding on to what Celine said earlier. The study was made amongst nearly 15,000 responders, so there were 14,000 surveys that were made on 7 markets that represent the highest market penetration of EVs. It resulted with a 60-page report, which was then even extended for the Polish version, and it presented 35 various predictions and forecasts for the market and how it will develop. Now, the goals of the study were threefold. First of all, the assessment of the EU consumer approach to BEVs, so battery electric vehicles, the fully electric vehicles. The second one was to present a model to predict the demand and how it will shape for these various vehicle powertrains until 2050. So comparing EVs versus their conventional counterparts and how that will develop in the coming decades. And then, of course, based on that, the third goal would analyze how these models of demand, how these predictions will be supported by the technology and perhaps elements of policy in Europe in the years to come. Now, the 7 markets that were analyzed were chosen because they represent 80% of the new vehicle registrations in Europe. And on the slide, you can see that, of course, EVs and the fully electric categories, so BEVs, have the largest representation in the Netherlands, Now that's the largest mix, largest market penetration. For Poland, this is 1% for 2020, but already for 2021, that was 1.5%, and we're looking at a 100% rise during the next year, so 2022. So these numbers are rapidly growing, and actually Poland emerges here as a nascent market, but one market that actually has the biggest opportunity, and it is at a point of where robust development can now take place, which is similar for the entire CE region. Now, the survey was made in a way that provided the opportunity to create a very structured market representation, and Celine presented this. Now, 8 cards like this were part of the survey, and they allowed respondents to really present a very detailed consumer approach to e-mobility by filling out the presented cards and survey cards, the questionnaires. And that allowed a structure of 3 various categories divided into 6 subcategories, where we had enthusiasts towards e-mobility and BEVs, pragmatists, and the so-called potential rejectors. Now, that last group is the most interesting because that last group is the one group that we have to address, that we have to target in our activities to promote e-mobility and further foster its implementation in the EU and in the CE in particular. This is especially important for the CE region because actually I believe, and the data show, that most of these potential rejectors actually really fit into the profile of the CE consumers. Now, amongst the potential rejectors, we had uninterested rejectors and unmet needs potential rejectors. The first group is a group that is less caring about environmental issues and less aware of environmental issues, but very concentrated on the price of vehicles. But the second category, what is called within the study the category of unmet needs, are those stakeholders that understand and are aware of climate challenges, of the problem with the climate neutrality goal, and the whole goal of actually developing e-mobility, but they are worried that their mobility needs will not be met by what zero-emission transport offers. So they have range anxiety, and they have various other associated problems with adopting BEVs. And hence, the results provide us with a very interesting picture. We can see that for Poland, which is the main focus of the Element Energy report that was enhanced by PSPA, we have nearly 90% of the responders who are actually positive towards e-mobility, positive towards BEVs. Very interestingly, we only have 2% uninterested rejectors. So the probably most radically against group, which cares about price, as I said, also combining that with some of the anxieties associated with doubting e-mobility. We have the unmet needs group at less than 10%, which is a very good sign, and it shows a very interesting trend for Poland when compared, for example, to leaders in e-mobility on the European continent, in the EU and in the UK, because as you see in Germany, there are quite a lot of uninterested rejectors, so those who pay attention to price in a large quantity. So very interesting results. But the study went on to analyze the intricacies of this consumer approach. So of course we start with the price. The uninterested rejectors are the ones who name price as their most important category. And here then we see a kind of scale of price where Poland is towards the right side of that scale. About 250,000 zloty, so about 50,000 euros, is the average price of an electric vehicle in Poland. And we see that every 10th of even the trailblazers, wealthy adopters, or environmentalists are actually interested in buying a vehicle if we base it on scale at this level where Poland is on the average level of EV prices. Now, of course, we see from this study, and it was suggested by the respondents, that if at-home charging, private charging infrastructure was more available, this could increase the BEV adoption by 7%. So that's a very interesting indicator, and one which probably would be agreed upon by most stakeholders, and I think EPBD should pursue those kinds of indicators, and the ones who will work on that directive as well. That's a clear indication of where those regulations should go. But we also have a comparison of various of these powertrains, or fuels actually, as we can say, and there is a baseline scenario for how they will shape demand for various powertrains in the coming years. And we see 2025 as a major point in time where these trends will change, and we see a rapid growth of BEV demand after this year. We see a rapid drop in diesel, internal combustion engines, and we see, of course, stable drops in the petrol, ICE vehicles, and the various hybrid models that are also analyzed. And of course, we see that if public charging infrastructure would be robustly developed, it could have a chance of rising the base scenario by 8%. So growing the demand of BEVs rapidly and clearly, visibly by nearly 10%, by nearly 1/10 of this parameter, which is a very interesting indicator as well. And actually here we refer to something that will be discussed later on during our webinar and our podcast regarding AFIR, so the public charging infrastructure development. Now, going into how dedicated platforms can drive the growth of BEV demand. And again, we have the baseline scenarios here and how it will develop, but we see an incredible impact of new dedicated BEV platforms, some that are implemented by companies like Mercedes, Volkswagen, Hyundai, who have dedicated platforms already for BEVs, where we see this rise as enormous. So even if we have the current development of dedicated platforms, this reduces car prices by 25%, which in turn can increase demand for BEVs, and 30%, because price is such an important factor in this process. So this is a very important factor, and it will play a crucial role in fueling this growth further. Now, for the Polish market in particular, we see the demand, so this is a kind of adjusted version of the base scenario. And here we see that for Poland in 2025, the crucial moment in time is shared by our market with the other markets. We see there a rapid growth of BEVs. We see a pretty sharp drop in diesel, ICE, internal combustion engines. And in 2030, actually, we see a complete drop in that. Now, this may vary depending on the various factors that can impact it. These factors can be based on the Fit for 55 legislation or various other things that may take place. But we know definitely that 2025 is a rapid growth in all combustion fuels and all fossil fuels as powertrains, which is very important and quite interesting as well. Also, highly indicative of how well projected the regulatory kind of strategies are for the Fit for 55 package. But going and delving into even deeper into the Polish market, we see a scenario where in 2025 we will near on 300,000 battery electric vehicles on this market. In 2022, there are 23,000 BEVs on this market. So this growth is exponential. And of course, Fit for 55, the ICE phase out, and the emission standards for passenger vehicles and vans as they were passed by the European Parliament in June. All these policies, together with the development of the My EV program in Poland, with the development of various other policies like the policy implemented in December supporting and the mechanism supporting the development of public infrastructure in Poland, and the popularity of both those programs, and the potential of other planned activities such as the proposed policy proposed by PSPA to support the import and subsidize the import of used EVs versus the old ICE vehicles that, of course, flood the CE market and create a problem that needs to be tackled. So all those policies may implement the positive outcome and the positive scenario where we will have on this Polish market the 300,000 vehicles in 2025, perhaps the projected million in 2030, and perhaps it will also be confirmed by the consumer approach, which so far shows that the European-wide study is clearly linked to what is actually recorded here in Poland by us. Every year, we repeat a study that shows the decision-making process of the average Pole towards BEVs and towards electromobility in general. And we see here that where in 2017, 12% Poles said that a PHEV or a BEV would be their considered next purchase, We have over 32% of those respondents last year, 2021. So an enormous growth. 3 times more people are becoming convinced that they want a BEV for their next vehicle. And that, I guess, is the optimistic ending to that presentation. And so we see that the goals are confirmed, the conclusions are confirmed. So the consumer choices are positively aimed at BEVs and developing electromobility. Let's see how the legal framework can actually respond to that. Thank you. So after these 2 presentations, we have a clear picture, an indication of the consumer approach to e-mobility. But is the legal framework ready? Are the objectives good? Are they well adapted? We have esteemed experts to bring this to our attention and present their considerations and valuable commentary. We have with us today Dr. Julia Hildermeyer, the Associate of the EU Program at RAP. We have Alicja Pawłowska, the Head of Energy and Climate Green Technologies Unit at the National Center for Climate Change in Poland. We have Peter Georgiev, Head of Strategy and Partnerships at MPECO. We have Aaron Fishbone, Charge Up Europe and Public Policy Director at Greenway. So 4 very esteemed speakers, and please listen to our conversation and discussion on the topics concerned.
So hello everybody. I have a great panel to moderate today. I have some esteemed experts and I would like to kind of see in the context of our report that we published how the outlook and the regulatory outlook applies to that. And mostly, of course, we'll be talking about Fit for 55 and AFIR. I have with me today Dr. Julia Hildermeyer, an associate of the EU program at RAP. I have Alicja Pion, Deputy Head of National Center for Climate Change. I have Aaron Fishbone, Charge Up Europe, but also Public Policy Director at Greenway. Hi, Aaron. And I have Peter Georgiev, who is Head of Strategy and Partnerships at MPECO. So really a EU-wide perspective. I will start with a question to Julia, if I may. The question is about AFIR and what opportunities does it offer for the EU as a whole?
Thanks, Alexander, and thanks for having me on this panel. Yeah, to start off, I think we can all agree that the alternative fuels infrastructure regulation is a tremendous opportunity when it comes to providing infrastructure for battery electric vehicles or electric vehicles, which are, of course, the most efficient means of clean transport that we have. And here, AFIR is really giving, for the first time, a regulation to create a pan-European framework for EV charging infrastructure as a whole. And that's a big opportunity because it creates the conditions for having one European EV market in which EV drivers can seamlessly drive across borders and travel between countries and all have ideally equal access to charging their vehicle when they need to in public. And when we go into a bit more detail on the AFIR, and I'm sure we will, there are targets that are set in a smart way. The targets for building charging infrastructure mean that the network of charging points will grow along with the market because they're spelled out as installed charging capacity per vehicle. So they're actually adapted to the size of the market of EVs, for example, that of Poland. And the target for build-out will grow with the actual needs. And that is, we think, a very agreeable approach to member states because it helps target investments into the right charging infrastructure. And the regulation will also have a geographical target, so to ensure coverage of charging infrastructure. And a substantial part of this will, of course, go to the European highways, to the TEN-T network and other major corridors. And this will connect, for example, the Polish market and also other Central and Eastern European markets to other major EV markets in Europe to ensure European, Europe-wide e-mobility. So in a nutshell, for us, AFIR is a really big opportunity to create what we called an essential charging network for Europe. And now, of course, there's more that policymakers can do to make sure charging stations are really best placed and that they're well used. And that's really key to reduce the cost of the transition to e-mobility and EV charging build-up, and more importantly, to reap the many additional benefits that it can offer for users, for the environment, and for power grids. But I'm sure we can do that.
Okay, thank you. So we have a broad perspective, but I'll turn to Aaron. It seems to be a regulation aimed at boosting the development of e-mobility in the EU. But what's the perspective of its implications for the CE market? Do you see that happening? Do you see that it's missing some of those elements? How would you assess that issue?
Excuse me. Yeah, well, thanks for convening this panel, Alex, and it's good to be here. I mean, I guess I'll go off of what Julia said, which is the idea that it's really trying to create now a pan-European internal market for e-mobility, which didn't exist before, right? It was really at the individual network level. I mean, like charging network level or member state level, or even, municipal level. And it was being built from the bottom up. And now it's really, this AFIR is looking at it building in a comprehensive network across all of Europe, and it should be done in a harmonized manner so that drivers, whether they're in Belgium or the Netherlands, whether they're in Bulgaria or Poland, are able to have a reliable, similar experience charging their electric vehicle, whether they're home or driving, exactly from Bulgaria all the way to Brussels and everywhere in between. That's very important. One difference that you'll see within the CE market is that, I mean, we work in markets and we're sitting in markets where there's lower levels of EV penetrations and smaller vehicle fleet sizes than in some of the more mature markets in Northern and Western Europe. And if everything was just left to go at its own pace, then it would continue to grow much more slowly. The infrastructure would grow more slowly alongside the small number of vehicles. Look, we know we're not primarily top tier markets for vehicle sales. Therefore, there are smaller numbers of vehicles. We are heavily reliant on a used car markets. So especially when it comes to the level of people, as opposed to companies and fleets who do buy a lot more first-hand vehicles, it would really be a few more years for the electric vehicles to filter their way towards Central and Eastern European markets. So AFIR, by applying the targets that Julia referenced, and those targets, by the way, we don't know what they're going to be. There is debate going on right now for the capacity-based targets here. I mean, the targets that are connected to the number of vehicles in the fleet, not the targets that are connected to the distance between them, between charging stations, but the targets that are connected to the vehicle size of the vehicle fleet are still under debate. And whether that should be something like, a consistent 1 kilowatt per battery electric vehicle, or whether it should be something that Charge Up Europe, for example, has advocated, which is a higher threshold at the beginning. So let's say 3 kilowatts per battery electric vehicle when a fleet size is still very small, say 1% of the overall fleet of a country is electrified, all the way, and then progressively decreasing as the fleet size grows. This is still up for debate, and we can discuss that here if you want, but I won't go into it right now in this introductory remarks. Suffice to say that this target setting can be done, if done properly in the way that we're suggesting, can be done to address the difference in the imbalance between fleet sizes and therefore overall maturity of the market and number of charging stations and amount of installed capacity in countries in Central and Eastern Europe, which tend to have smaller vehicle EV fleet sizes, and those in Northern and Western Europe. I'll leave it there. There's a number of other ways, but this would be, say, the primary way in which could really, really close that gap and prevent a two-speed Europe from deepening. You're on mute, Alex. We don't hear you.
Thank you. So yeah, and so for a very kind of market-oriented perspective, Alicja Pawłowska-Piorun, the head of Energy and Climate Green Technologies Unit at KOSK. Alicja, could you tell us, because Poland is a very large market. We've got 20 million vehicles in the car park, but only about 22,000 EVs. Not too many charging stations. We just crossed over 2,100 charging stations, public charging stations. Do you think, how could you assess AFIR with the tools that it provides for the Polish market? And tell us if the Polish market is responsive to that. Is it ready? Is it willing to implement those tools?
Thank you, Alexander, for giving me an opportunity to be a part of that panel and show some Polish perspective on the AFIR. First of all, in my opinion, AFIR gives us targets, very ambitious targets, but not many tools. For me, there are rather more like tips in which direction we should go rather than real tools. And of course, there are three main targets for me called infrastructure, interoperability, and information. So 3A, and all of them are crucial for our market. As you mentioned before, our infrastructure is, how to say it gently, we don't have it. We don't have a lot of charging station, and of course not so many electric cars, but there are a lot of investment ongoing. And PSPA have a lot of information about the plans of Polish companies. So it's very promising. But of course, as Julia and Aaron mentioned previously, we need to stop thinking about just the Polish market. We need to start thinking about pan-European market and how Polish basic charging infrastructure fits to, for example, German basic infrastructure, and how it's connected to other charging infrastructure. So for me, we need to change our mindset, and this is the crucial topic for me for now. Thank you.
Okay, and so connecting the charging infrastructure across Europe is also a business challenge. So I'll use Peter's extensive knowledge, and I'll probe a little bit around that. Peter, how do you assess the impacts on the business models for EV charging, and especially for the CE region of what AFIR entails?
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Alex, and really happy to be here with all of you today. Yeah, I'll be happy to share a bit more about what we see from my company's perspective, not just in the Central European market, but also globally. But going back a step back to the discussion on AFIR and some of the comments that were mentioned earlier, I think indeed the core topic, the core political debate in AFIR is the targets. And yes, these are political, but I think it's also very positive that the importance of EV charging and EV charging even as a service has been growing in terms of its political importance, because this ultimately attracts private investment to businesses. It gives a signal that the transition to EVs is on the top of the agenda in a way. And now it's up to different stakeholders like the ones represented here, but also more broadly in different alliances, to communicate, to streamline and clarify some of the more technical issues in order to have really a good business case. So when it comes to the business case itself, I think it's important to look at the different types of infrastructure, the different use case of the chargers. And here we can talk about the public domain, but we shouldn't forget also about the private domain. So I would be happy to share more insights in the later part of this webinar. But maybe the main issue for businesses right now, it's really with regards to getting up to the right speed, because the pace that we need to keep in order to reach those targets, be it the targets in AFIR or generally the targets in the Fit for 55, we really need to speed up all those processes with regards to gaining different permitting, be it for the property or the grid, and even installation of the chargers. We need to get a sufficient workforce to put up the chargers with the speed that we need to. So there's a lot on that end as well. And I think one thing is sure, I mean, EV charging businesses can achieve growth all around Europe, and this is mainly thanks to innovation, I have to say. And when we talk regulation, we also need to make sure that we enable a single market approach where we stimulate those innovative solutions and products. And we don't need to have a very fragmented EU market where in order for you to operate as a business, you have to have essentially 27 different products. So we need to really avoid that too. Yeah, I mean, those are some of my initial remarks. I'll be happy to discuss further.
Okay, thank you. Okay, going into what is and what isn't in AFIR, there are, I think, important elements like roaming regulations, rights of plug. I know it overlaps with other Fit for 55 legislation, but we are speaking here on the basis of a consumer choice study report. And so should everything be regulated by AFIR, or should perhaps consumers actually have the choice to select certain technologies or not? Aaron, could you maybe try to enlighten us? What could be added to make things better, and what could perhaps what doesn't have to be in AFIR to make e-mobility as consumer friendly as it can be?
Right. How much time do I have for this answer? No, look, I mean, AFIR is incredible in that it is going to be the first piece of European Union-wide legislation that will comprehensively regulate and set out the entire governance framework for e-mobility in a way that's not existed before in Europe. In that sense, I mean, it's groundbreaking, and it will be the landmark piece of legislation, and it will really create the governance framework and the regulatory environment in which every entity which operates in the e-mobility ecosystem has to function. So in that sense, it should set up the right boundaries. It should create the rules of the game in which we all operate and which we can understand how to play. It should also address market failures, some of which exist now and some of which might exist later, which I'll mention in a second. But of course, we don't want to be over-regulated. I mean, innovation and new good ideas and competing ideas have to come from somewhere, and there's lots of different companies entering the space with ideas for new applications, new technologies, new services, new ways of bundling different things. And that's all good because that's going to end up benefiting the consumer. Of course, there might be some false starts, some bad attempts that don't succeed, and some people will experience them along the way, but I mean, that's the case with every sector and with every space. And that is the creative process, right? So the regulation, of course, needs to find this tough balance between really creating the governance framework for an industry that is new, but growing quickly and didn't really exist until a few years ago. And also, creating the space for innovation and especially free choice for customers, letting people be able to choose what providers they want to use, where they want to charge, how they want to charge. And it might be different for even the single user in a different, in the course of a day or a week based upon what they're trying to do, if they're just driving around their home community, if they're going on a long distance trip or something like that. So that's a tough balance to strike. That being said, maybe two or three specifics. Roaming. Roaming is a great example where, I mean, there's lots of companies which have different services to offer. So roaming is the ability for people or drivers to have a home mobility service provider. So maybe you're a member of the Greenway charging network and you want to leave the Greenway network and go charge, go into Germany and charge at an ENBW charging station. You can do that even using your Greenway authentication device, your card or your mobile application, because we have a roaming relationship with that company. And so therefore Greenway customers can go charge there. But it's a private business to business relationship. It's not necessarily the case for all charging stations out there. And so customers do, if they want to use roaming as opposed to ad hoc charging, they need to know which companies their home EMP is roaming with. And it's not going to be every single one. So we have called for roaming to be regulated. So roaming was not regulated in the AFIR. It was not proposed that they would include roaming in it. They would only look at ad hoc charging and type of charging where a customer can show up at any charging station, any public charging station or publicly accessible charging station, and without being registered, without having to identify who they are, just use their payment method, whatever that is, pay right there for the kilowatts that they're charging, and then move on. No relationship with the company operating that charging station past that charging session. Roaming, on the other hand, involves a longer-term relationship. You're a registered member of some mobility service provider. So the Commission didn't propose to regulate roaming in AFIR. We think actually it should be regulated, but only at a minimum level. So it should be the case that publicly accessible charging stations, in order to achieve the goal of creating a really successful, seamless internal market for people to drive all around Europe and recharge, that publicly accessible charging stations should be roaming capable and should have a connection with at least one roaming hub or one external mobility service provider. This is to prevent the market failure where some charge point operators might use the fact that they have a location, they have real estate, they have infrastructure in the ground and contracts with that local land, which allow them to have a monopoly on that land. And if someone shows up at that charging station and needs to recharge, and there's roaming is not an option at that station, and there are those cases right now, and I consider those market failures, they have no other recourse than to pay the rates that that charge point operator is asking for. Therefore, we have suggested that roaming, and just the fact that roaming is possible and roaming happens with at least one provider, is something that should be regulated, required, in order to ensure that this big pan-European internal market does exist and gives drivers the choice if they want to use a roaming authentication method or if they want to use an ad hoc payment method to start their session. So I think that's a good example of a base level of regulation to create the floor without getting into sort of contractual conditions between players, without over-regulating.
All right. I'm going to have to ask Alicia and Julia my questions now because they have more limited time. So I'll go straight. I'll ask actually first maybe Alicia, if you can tell us a little bit about what has been done in Poland to prepare the market for AFIR. Were there some policies introduced already? We asked about Poland because it is the largest market of the CE, and the CE is the main point of focus of this conversation.
Very good question about how we are preparing. First of all, in 2016, when electromobility development plan has been launched, 5 areas of state intervention were identified. As you probably know, demand, supply, regulation, infrastructure, and awareness. And all these areas should be financially supported to some extent. It is mainly the area of National Fund for Environmental Protection and Water Management that operates here. The fund is financing purchase of vehicles, not only passenger cars, but also buses, and financing the charging infrastructure. And according to every available information, these contests are quite popular in Poland. Of course, this is not just a success story. The real problem for me is the import of millions of used cars to Poland. And there are no easy solutions here. Everybody knows it. In addition, the electrification of public transport is a challenge in the context of the fight against transport exclusion, transport poverty. So the 3 things from me. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for being here with us. I know you have following appointments, so thank you for your contribution. And that being said, and so Aaron, thank you for bringing into perspective the things that could be in AFIR, but are maybe not regulated as they should be. But what about smart solutions, smart tariffs, shared services, smart charging, all those aspects? Should that be AFIR regulated, or are there other acts of regulation that should pertain to this? And actually, this is a question for Julia. If you could, what is your view on that?
Thanks, Alexander. It will actually be interesting, because I'm sure that other panelists have views on this as well, but I'll give it a start, because I think that that AFIR is, again, a very good opportunity to provide, to require the basic smartness that charging infrastructure needs to be able to give to the market, to let the whole system of charging services, of innovative smart charging services to develop. Let me first quickly explain why what I mean by smart charging and why it's really key for EV deployment, and then get back to legislation. By smart charging, I refer to basically any technology and services for managing EV charging optimally. So that EVs can be charged when energy costs are lowest, when renewables are or can best be absorbed in the system, and when it's generally best for the system. And that's really a key condition to enable savings for consumers, for EV drivers, but actually also for service providers who own or run charging points and offer services. But it's also a saving at the system level overall, which then enables that actually everyone can save on their electricity bills, not just EV drivers, also people that don't own an EV yet. So we really sort of want to stress every time we speak about smart charging, the bigger benefits of this. And that's why it's so key that every charging point that is installed via AFIR, if it's publicly accessible, but actually also via other legislation, for example, the building codes that are being renewed at the moment, the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, that charging infrastructure that is being installed is smart charging capable, which means that it's able to measure and communicate consumption of EVs, so charging can be optimized. And that's for us, really a key condition of this essential network that we have the chance to create in Europe, because this will enable a market of competing services that can be offered to the consumer. So they indeed have the choice to charge the way that fits them best, because we simply will see very different use cases in the future. It's going to be private, it's going to be fleet-based, it's going to be, we're going to speak about electric delivery vans, electric trucks that we're going to see in the market. So all of these need to have very different charging needs and need services that optimize the charging to reduce cost for everyone. So this is indeed a requirement that we think AFIR can make possible, and that the EPBD and the building codes can require for cases of residential charging, workplace charging, but even also for logistics depots. So for electric deliveries, once these truck fleets will be electric, these trucks are parked overnight and delivering during the day. Their charging can be optimized. It's a huge gap, and it's a great opportunity if this was part of the EPBD. But that's a side remark. Because I have the floor, I quickly want to add that AFIR also offers a great opportunity to enable smart grid-based planning of charging points, and that is actually crucial. We've seen in the consumer study that, for example, in Poland, the growth of EVs in the last 2 years has been absolutely remarkable. So that means we need to think about planning the charging infrastructure now. The planning has to start immediately, and it has to make sure that that charging points are built where it's best for the consumers, for the drivers who want to charge, but also where it's best for the grid. So where the capacity is actually already there. So we can avoid costly grid upgrades and use the capacity that's already there. And that's what we mean by smart or grid-based planning, which is something where member states can help, and the AFIR actually offers a strategic rollout plan that gives some ideas to member states and to cities to do this kind of planning and mapping exercise. Where do people need to charge? Where's the grid capacity? Where can we build the charging points with capacity we need to optimally develop the market of charging services? I'll stop here. I'm sure we can talk a lot more about smartness, but zooming back to our key asks, smart charging infrastructure, wherever it's built, needs to be smart charging capable. Key condition.
Okay, Pira, what are your views on this? Because I'm sure you'll have something to share as well on this topic.
Yeah, I mean, quite a lot of very, very important points were made clearly. Just one of the last remarks that Julia made about the smart grid planning, definitely a very good opportunity. It's something that we see already happening out of necessity, even for some of the operators, because they just want to have a profitable business model. And that's the way to go if you plan also according to the grid and its current capacity. And also another thing that is quite relevant to that is the tender sort of times that the charging point operators can use the land for the charging point, because that's also linked to the business model. But yeah, I mean, all the things that were mentioned also in the case of roaming, in the case of smart tariff services, those are ultimately underpinned by, from my perspective, by protocols and standardization, because that's something that connects all the customer aspect of it. So the ability to have a really integral market where you have competition, where you have transparency, and ultimately that benefits the consumer. That's achieved through standardization. In the world of EV charging, there's a set group of protocols that offer that. One is the OCPP, for example. The other one is the OCPI for roaming. And the roaming can happen in many different ways. It could happen through a platform. It could happen to peer-to-peer sort of contractual relationships, and maybe some other innovative ways as well through a different type of hub approach. And this should be free of choice. I mean, I agree with the position of the industry here generally that this should be mandated, but it shouldn't be mandated how. So it should be more like a guideline to have a way for companies to achieve it, but not necessarily ask for one specific way. Because ultimately, all those different business models, they bring different financial benefits. And it's the same with different tariffs. I mean, when we have smart charging, you can provide also all those different tariffs for consumers in their different use cases for charging. So it could be a plan which bundles public, private, home, all in one. It could be something that offers also fleet owners to reimburse their employees, and this is probably something that the market will take care of itself. I think, again, maybe to reiterate from my perspective, it would be important to increase the utilization rates of the chargers in the end of it all, and roaming and smart charging does it. Certainly, because the more the charger is being used and the more it's actually uptime, the more it's available. I think it's what will bring also a good business model to the market. Even if we have a target setting approach, if that business is not really profitable, it's not very advantageous to go into it. So we also have to make it a market where it's profitable to develop the charging solutions. One thing that is not oftentimes said is that a lot of the chargers that are especially on the highways, they're not really used, especially in the markets that are not mature. And this is something that needs to be addressed. I think the AFIR could offer an opportunity to include the utilization rate of the chargers as also something that that can be mandated. Of course, that could be seen by operators as something too drastic, but just to give you a small calculation, if you have 99% charging availability or uptime, the reliability, if it's 99%, that's 3 days in the year that the charger is not working. If you have 95, that's 14 days. And I had a look recently at some numbers in the States, which really scared me, of uptimes of around 60-70%. So that's also very relevant to the business case, and ultimately it's relevant for the consumers who don't want to get stuck somewhere expecting that the charger is working, but it's not. So yeah, I think that's something that I would add at this point.
Okay, I know Julia has one more remark about tariffs specifically, and then I'll come back to you, Aaron. Don't worry, I did not forget. Julia, please.
Thanks. It's hard for RAP to be on a panel and not speaking of tariffs. So I think Bitbetter mentioned it very rightly. Tarification is for us really the other big part of making, let's say, EV grid integration successful, and tarification is something that has been let's say put into motion through electricity market reforms on the European level, and that need to be carried on in an ambitious way by member states. So each regulator in each member state can help to set the conditions for EV users to make the most of charging, because they will need to see prices that help them to charge when it's best for them and for the system. So when charging is cheaper because of price, a tariff can reflect it. It's cheaper overnight. It's cheaper when renewables are already there to absorb. It's cheaper overnight because the grids are less congested. So it's really important that there are price signals through tariffs that help users to direct the charging, to use the flexibility that their EVs offer them to charge when it's best for them, for the grid. And they can, there are savings that can be made on individual level. They're very interesting savings that can be made on fleet level. And there are, more, let's say, ways to remunerate, to pay for all the additional grid services that EVs can give to the to the grid through smart charging. And all of this happens, the better, the more tariffication gives these signals. So we need time varying tariffs in some shape or form for energy, but also for the network component. And let me just explain that. That's the part, the network tariffs are the part, are what and how we pay for using the power grids to charge electricity in the EV. And in many countries, and I know that Poland is one of these, this part of the electricity bill tends to be quite high and tends to be a barrier also for, let's say, charging service providers, because the way these tariffs work, charging providers will pay for the capacity they have installed that they can offer to customers. They will not be asked to pay for the actual consumption, the actual electricity that is charged or passed on to EVs. And that makes a huge difference. So a provider can be required to pay thousands of euros annually, but perhaps only very few cars charged at the beginning because the market is still young, and that's not a very interesting business case. And I'm mentioning this example because in Poland there's a great remedy for this. It's a very specific tariff. It's the e-tariff. It's a distribution tariff that's offered to charge point operators, to service providers, that actually works a bit differently. So it's adjusted to, if you want, to the number of cars that charge at the station, or to the consumption. It's volumetric. And it's not based on the capacity. And this helps to even out this in the beginning, to offer providers of services an entry into that market. And this is an interesting learning that other European member states can make when they think about how they need to reform their network tariffs in order to reward flexible consumption, such as electric transport, in a way to integrate it much better into the grid and unlock a multitude of flexibility services. These services are actually already available. It's not something that's happening somewhere in the future. Smart charging is already available. In a recent report which just published, we counted 140 such services across European countries. And it's only fair if all EV users in all EV markets have equal access to these, so they can reap the same benefits. So this is why tariffication is key, and that is clearly going beyond AFIR. It's through a regulatory reform, it's electricity market reform on member state level that is mostly required here to make this happen. And this requires very good collaboration and transparency by and with grid operators, who are really the main partners here, that should, show data, show what's happening on the grid, help reward flexibility, help to integrate all these flexible resources. And this can happen at very small scale to really interesting pilots that we learn from and can spread. So there's ample opportunity here, I also hope that the bits and pieces that would help this in the Fit for 55 package sort of unlock a dynamic that will lead to more progressive electricity market design, so EVs can be used in the best interest.
All right. Well, thank you. And that brings us to this issue of regulating things either on the EU level or the national level. Actually, let's shift away maybe from infrastructure just a little bit and going to the ice leakage problem. Aaron, what is your view on this? How does the Fit for 55 package, if at all, respond to this challenge? How do you think it should be, not resolved, but addressed?
Alexander, clearly, if I had the answer to that question, I would I would have written a book about that, and it would be selling like hotcakes. No, I mean, it's a huge topic. So what you're referring to here is the sad fact that people in lower income countries are buying vehicles primarily on the second, third, fourth hand market, right? And some of these vehicles can be anywhere, any number of years old, 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And, you and I have done some research, Pitar as well, showing that, in Bulgaria, something like over half of the vehicle fleet is over 20 years. Similar in Czechia, it's about 16 years, and comparably, and like that in Poland. So these vehicles get progressively dirtier over their lifetime. They're not repaired in the same way. They have various filter parts that don't exist anymore, or even they were from a previous Euro standard that didn't have quite the let's say kind of cleanliness requirements of the newer vehicles, even combustion engine vehicles. So there is a lot of air pollution, and there's a lot of other emissions, exhaust given out by these vehicles, and they end up, their predominant fleet size of the fleets in many Central Eastern European countries are filled with these older vehicles. So that's what we're talking about. How do you address this situation? I mean, they're significantly cheaper than even a new combustion engine car, or much less a hybrid or even an electric vehicle, right? So the person buying a 2,000 euro, old Mercedes Benz is probably not the same customer as going to be able to buy even, a Skoda Citigo, right? It's a fundamentally different price point that person is looking at. So how do you address this issue? Well, I mean, certainly the cost is, the single greatest determining factor here. And so awareness, as the previous colleague from Poland was talking about, that's the fifth plank of their plan. Awareness, so that people know what electric vehicles are, what's available out there for them, how to go about getting one, that they're decent cars and whatnot, is a crucial step there. And then, but the most important factor is the upfront cost that person, especially in the case of a person, pays when they pay for a vehicle. Probably one of the biggest things that could happen from the private sector side would be the role of fleets. And fleets, so companies, larger companies, which are the primary buyers of new vehicles throughout Europe, and especially in Central and Eastern European countries, and are also able to amortize the cost of that vehicle over its lifetime. And they're not just looking at the upfront sticker price as people tend to do. And are able to so they kind of make that more accounting based purchase decision would be a great vector to look at, and to figure out how to address that segment of the market, so that when they're making buying decisions, they're buying electric. And there is a bunch of campaigns out there already looking at sort of at the European level, looking at the Clean Vehicles Directive, and I'm sure Petar and Julia can add in some other examples here of efforts that are being done at the European level to electrify fleets. Also, LeasePlan and Business Lease recently merged, and other companies have made their own, fleet companies and leasing companies have made their own corporate buying decisions. DPD at the group level has made an electrification commitment. IKEA has, Amazon famously has, and again, I'm sure there's a Skanska. I'm sure there's other companies out there who have done so. So ways to incentivize and encourage companies to make decisions to go electric is a huge step in the right direction. There's probably could be kind of incentives at different levels, and penalties also levied at other levels. In the last round of the CO2 standards for cars and vans, there was also both credits, so incentives, and also penalties given to vehicle manufacturers that manufactured vehicles that did not at the overall. So at the average of their overall fleet manufactured each year, they could only have a certain amount of kilograms of emissions per grams of CO2 per kilometer of vehicle, and so they were penalized if they violated that. Those are the things that could happen at the European level. However, what we've learned is regulating the sale of vehicles between people and between countries within the European Union, especially after it's left the first-hand market, is not a competence that is at the European level. And there's only something that could potentially be up to member states or municipalities if they wanted to regulate that, because that would be a violation of sort of internal market principles at the European level. So member states have looked at, or different jurisdictions have looked at, penalizing pollution. So the more emissions your vehicle gives off, the more you have to pay in taxes. Effectively, it's a sin tax. They've also looked at providing purchase incentives to encourage and incentivize people to buy cleaner vehicles or electric vehicles or zero emissions vehicles. And then of course they give privileges to people to users and drivers of cleaner vehicles. So zero and low emission zone, as you famously know, privileges of where they can park at municipal parking, parking downtown, using certain lanes or throughways that they can drive, or maybe only buses can, and people have zero emissions vehicles. But to actually interrupt the flow of vehicles from, kind of firsthand owners to people who are looking to buy a much more affordable, second, third, fourth-hand car is something that we're finding to be extremely difficult. Scrappage schemes is something else worth looking at. And I'll leave it there. I know that was a sort of a grab bag of answers, and let the colleagues respond.
Well, as you said, it's an enormous area of discussion, but yeah, I was, if there is a solution at a regulatory level, that's what I was kind of looking at. Peter, what is your view? I know all of the CE shares the same problem Aaron mentioned. It's actually 14 years the average age of used vehicles in Poland. Enormous problem, of course. And in our consumer choice study report, we do kind of see a pretty quick process of consumers choosing zero emission vehicles. Do you see that happening, Peter, now from your perspective? And perhaps you want to add on to what Aaron was saying as well.
Yeah, I mean, starting from the point that Aaron mentioned on fleets, I mean, absolutely agree. I've been a long proponent of that as well, and it's good to hear that discussion evolving. Hopefully, that can have some specific results sometime soon at European level as well. But clearly, some leading major corporates have done the right steps, pledging to electrify their fleet in the context of the EV100 or similar. But it's really about all companies, not just the major ones. I can give you an example. I live in Sofia right now, and businesses here are not really thinking about electrifying their fleet as something that comes natural to them, because we're also here talking about understanding the profitability of an EV compared to a combustion engine still. And I think even companies who want to electrify, they would be helped more by as I mentioned, less red tape earlier, right? To install the chargers in their buildings, and not necessarily from a grant to purchase the vehicle. I think the grants for purchasing the vehicles can help in some markets, especially if you're an auto producing market. But even in some of the more mature markets now, we don't really see that helping more than the help for installing chargers and making sure you have the whole ecosystem running, not just the vehicle. So I would really add that and say that it would be generally more helpful if governments look at supporting companies through different tax breaks or facilitating the installation of chargers for them.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that.
Just to mention, the AFIR program in France is a good example of that.
Mm-hmm. So I only have time for the last question. I mean, there's endless amounts of topics we could discuss, and you guys have incredible amounts of knowledge on this topic. But so we have the ice leakage, we have these polluters, but it's also the question of HDVs. Julia, if you could elaborate on what regulation can do, what AFIR does on helping to decarbonize heavy-duty vehicles. For Poland, an enormous problem. We're the largest operator of HDVs. We also, Polish companies are the most cargo carriers in terms of mass. So this is a big challenge. Could you elaborate on that just as a final touch to our discussion?
I think it's an excellent final question, because it's really the big missing piece of when we discuss the e-mobility market in Europe and how it evolves. I mean, bringing electric trucks to the road is really the next big step to decarbonize road transport, and particularly the freight sector. And here again, I think AFIR is one important part of legislation, as in that it recognizes this potential, and it sets clear targets for building truck charging hubs along highways to electrify freight corridors in Europe, and these are key for major freight markets in Poland, as you pointed out. So these targets should be ambitious, and here I think we've seen and research has shown this in the last month, that the AFIR proposal is not strong enough. It actually underestimates the total number of battery electric trucks that we're likely to see on the road in 2030, quite a bit, quite substantially, and that means that we think that the targets that are currently, or that are in discussion, For the highways, for equipping the core highway network, the connections between middle-sized cities, but also the targets as to equip urban nodes, urban centers with the truck charging stations. But these targets need to be increased to help get going the planning now for the electric trucks that we're likely to see in 5 and 10 years. Beyond AFIR, which sort of sets a first essential charging infrastructure for these, there's more that can be done with other parts of the 55 package. For example, through the EPBD that could include, and I think I mentioned this earlier, charging infrastructure requirements for depots. Here's where AFIR and EPBD go together. When a logistic depot is publicly accessible, it would be through an AFIR requirement that it would have to have charging points for trucks, and if it's a fully private logistics depot, it would fall under the EPBD. But the objective is the same. It's to prepare electric truck charging in use cases that are really low-hanging fruit. Where we have fleets that have idle parking times, where charging infrastructure is relatively easy to install, and where we see that the total cost of ownership of electric trucks in a fleet can be very interesting, or will be interesting in the near future. That's a sneak preview of current research we're doing together with the International Council on Clean Transportation, and a report that will be publishing in a couple of weeks from now, and we've looked at electric logistics fleets, so inner urban delivery, and what we see is that the total cost of ownership of electric trucks is becoming very soon very interesting, and can actually be helped with cleverly designed policy incentives, such as bonus model schemes or purchase incentives that help to overcome this initial barrier for fleet operators, but that need to be designed in a smart way. So they basically phase out this incentives as soon as we don't need it anymore, as soon as the prices of electric trucks will have gone down, with scales, with falling battery cost, and all the dynamics of the market that we know. But here is really where where charging infrastructure for heavy duty vehicles is really important to be built out now. So commercial players, freight operators, depot owners, logistic companies can overcome this initial burden and trust that they will be able to charge their cars, and that they can get to financially interesting solutions with electric fleets. And I think with this, if we prepare this in a clever way now, we can really help this market to scale up in the next decade, which will need to cut transport emissions overall to meet the EU climate targets after all. So again, the legislation can help here, and it's all again about smart planning and smart charging of these electric trucks in the future.
Thank you very much for being with us today. It was great to present both of the presentations to you, both of the reports and the findings to you. It was a pleasure to moderate the discussion with our esteemed guests. Thank you very much, and we will come back with further commentary for further frameworks very soon.